Okay, seeing quorum in the room, I will call the meeting to order and look for a mover to approve the agenda. Don't all put your hand up at once. Thank you, Trustee Penny. Are there any changes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the agenda? That carries. We have no delegations tonight. So we are then on to our matter for action, which is report 19-032, base rate increase for nonprofit. Oh, I forgot the briefings. We're just, sorry. Yes. I know. I'm sorry about that. Briefing from the chair.
Thank you very much. And tonight I do have one item, and that is with regard to the fact that on Friday, the 29th of March, the ministry announced some interim changes to the education development charges regulation to provide school boards with the ability to propose modest education development charge rate increases of 5% while the government continues to review the EDC policy framework. These amendments do not restrict the ability of boards to pass bylaws for the full 5-year term, which we did at our board meeting on the 26th of March last week. Further information is contained in Memo 19-055, which is on your desks this evening.
Are there any questions on the chair's briefing? Seeing none, I'll look to the director for her briefing.
Through you, Madam Chair. The federal government's action plan for Youth by Youth includes an initiative to publish a document coming out of the National Dialogue Series on LGBTQ+ health, wellness, and gender-based violence hosted by the Center for Global Education. Based on previous contributions, our high school Colonel Bai was designated as one of 10 national leaders in the program. As a national leader, Colonel Bai participated in the CGE Dialogue Initiative, which ran through the winter and spring and into the spring of 2019. They attended an in-person culminating activity in Edmonton with other designated students and schools. The team from Colonel Bai has contributed to the culminating document that will be published and may be presented here in Ottawa this fall. The 3 students and the teacher represented Colonel Bai, the OCDSB, and Ontario at the event are Laura Pettifer, grade 11, Scott Sharma, grade 11, and Nora Wilson, grade 11. The teacher who accompanied them is Paul Chapman. The head of tech education, Cam Bird, is also a teacher who established the Colonel Bai's relationship with CGE and is always finding creative ways of integrating its programs and opportunities into our curricular and extracurricular programs. World Autism Day. Today is World Autism Day. The goal of the day is to help in the building of stronger, more inclusive communities for people with autism spectrum disorder. One of the ways in which our school celebrated this day is by participating in the Raise the Flag campaign in collaboration with Autism Ontario. Students incorporated the flag into their activities to celebrate the diversity of our students as we continue to promote inclusion and acceptance in our schools. Additionally, the ASD team will be hosting another Parent Information Night on Tuesday, April 23rd at 6 p.m. at Sir Robert Borden High School. Dr. Jonathan Weiss from York University will be the keynote speaker and will address mental health and well-being in regards to students with ASD. The ASD team will also be present to provide many workshops for parents regarding supports and services within the district. School climate survey for students in grades 4 to 12 will be conducted in all schools during the period from April 23rd to May 10th. The survey is completely anonymous, and parents will be asked to sign a consent form for their children to participate. Information for parents will be posted on the district and school websites on April the 5th. Regarding upcoming event, there are reports that students from across the province are organizing a possible walkout in protest of recent announcements made by the provincial government impacting education. The proposed date is April the 4th. The proposed walkout is not a school or district sanctioned event, but the safety of our students continues to remain our priority. To this end, we, the district, has provided school leaders with guiding principles for communication and for ensuring safety. A letter has been prepared by communications, and this letter will be posted on the district website and referenced in social media. That's all from my report, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the director's report? I did have one. With regards to the school climate item, when you are saying students in grades 4 to 12, it's all of our schools, and is it all students, or is it a sampling of students, or how is it decided who participates in that survey?
At this time, it's my understanding that it is all students who have access to participate.
Okay, is this something we do every year?
It is not every year. I'm not sure, AD Reynolds, how frequently do we conduct this survey?
It's on a cycle for students every second year and parents in alternate years. Oh, sorry, and it's for students grade 4 to 12.
Great, thank you. So it's something all students grade 4 to 12 do every second year, and a permission form goes home to the parent for that?
In the past, we've operated on an opt-out basis. We make parents aware of the survey and the types of questions being asked, and give them with an opportunity to inform the school if they're not comfortable with their child participating. That's what we've done in the past.
So this is the first year it's an opt-in?
It is a non-consent return. So a notice goes home, and if the parent doesn't want their child to participate, they send the non-consent back to school. If they want their child to participate, they don't have to return anything to the school.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions on the director's report? Seeing none, we have no delegations, and now we will move on to matters for action. Report 19-032, base rate increase for nonprofit leases for 29-2020. Director.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair, I'll call on CFO Carson and his team to take us through this report.
Thanks, Madam Chair. You have before you, beginning on page 1 of tonight's package, our recommendation for an increase to the base rate for not-for-profit leases. As we've indicated in the report, we did not increase this rate last year because the ministry at that time had talked about introducing new guidelines for the preparation of those costs. Those were never formally released. Some guidelines around cost accounting were produced. However, there were no guidelines. Staff have considered the fact that we did miss a year, and we don't want to find ourselves in the situation where we were a few years ago, where in order to catch up to costs, we had to impose a larger increase than would otherwise be necessary. So, as noted in the report, we are proposing an increase of approximately 3.2%. It would bring that base rate to $10.62. Over the weekend, we did receive some questions from trustees. Thanks very much. The total amount of revenue being generated by the increase would be about $47,000. Probably 80% of that would come from childcares, and the other 20% is from a group of not-for-profits categorized as other. And I think it's important to note that this is separate from the discussion about community use of schools and any potential change in those fees. Those are dealt with later on during the board's overall budget. So I think, Madam Chair, if there are questions, Karen and I will do our best to answer them.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Lyra.
Bullet 4, or number 4, resource implications, this is assuming the amount of overall space does not change, the purported rate increase would result in a small increase to partially offset an increase in costs. I'm wondering what you mean by partially.
Madam Chair, the costs that we're looking at with respect to these groups are the labor costs of the staff involved, as well as just the ongoing operating and utility costs. So we have seen over the last 24 months increases in salary costs for our custodial staff that are supporting the tenants, as well as just the ongoing costs of utilities and supplies that are being used, custodial supplies, snow plowing, and all of the usual services.
So I'm sort of wondering why it is we're only trying to recover part of these costs from the people that are utilizing our space.
Madam Chair, our practice has been to try to follow the CPI changes as reported by Stats Canada. That's the 3.2%. We've stayed away from trying to get more precise than that, and I think recognizing the amount of money involved as part of the board's total budget, we felt that that was an approximation. When we say partially, it is difficult to really pin that down because each school will have its own unique cost structure. So we use the term partially. We could have said approximately.
Thank you.
Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, and I'd like to thank the Superintendent for his report, and I'd like to move the recommendation on page 2.
Would you like introduction?
None required, Madam Chair.
Okay, Ms. Handela?
Just to further the conversation, I'm curious as to, and maybe I'm misunderstanding how it's presented, it appears that a break from the CPI adjustment was taken for a year and it's going to be imposed, but it seems to be we're still lagging a year. So why 3.2? Why not try and target the CPI? Already understanding that CPI is a very rough approximation and has no direct bearing on the actual cost increases the board is incurring, why not try and at least bring a CPI target of maybe 3.5 to approximate the full 2-year CPI lag and not have the board behind again and again and again?
Madam Chair, we had discussions about whether we should try to make up what hadn't been collected. We made the decision that we were also mindful of the impact on our childcare partners, our tenants, and what's happening with their own funding level. We have always aimed these to approximate the recovery from the province of Ontario, and so we were comfortable with this amount. It could have gone up a little bit higher, it could have been a little less, but this is the practice that we have followed, and as in a lot of the things we do, it was the compromise that we as staff were comfortable with, and why we're proposing the amounts we are this evening.
Could you tell us what the total CPI would be to make up the 2 years versus the 3.2? If we're going with StatsCan numbers, what would be the actual?
Madam Chair, if you were going to go back and include the prior year, you're probably closer to a total of 4.5% to 5%.
And what would the revenue target of 4.5% mean for the board? What are we leaving on the table? What are the trustees and their decision leaving on the table here?
Madam Chair, give or take, probably each 1% is about $15,000. So if we're to use the committee member's term, there's a shortfall there of about $20,000, $20,000 to $22,000.
Thank you.
Wait, there was some confusion. Trustee Penny, was your hand up? No. Okay. Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Ms. Handela for her questions, because that took away some of my questions. I'm left with only one, and that is, I understand there was a baseline done some years ago, and that effectively we've been using the proxy of CPI since then. But how many years ago was the baseline costing done, and when do we anticipate doing another rebaselining? Thank you.
Madam Chair, we have always looked at both our rentals and our community use of schools as a whole. I think it's important to note that these rates apply to our not-for-profit partners and our childcare partners. When we have other tenants, we are charging more than that, usually based on that ability to pay. What we have tried to do is match the amount as close as we could, the amount per square foot, to the amount we would be receiving from the province per square foot for operating costs. And that amount, I believe, is about $10.50 to $10.70. I forget the exact amount with some of the adjustments. It's in that $10.50 range. And so we believe that this rate of increase is appropriate. There was a provincial group, because as trustees remember, there's a lot of boards don't charge anything to childcares, and that was one of the proposals that had been made provincially a couple of years ago. There is a detailed cost accounting exercise that they have people go through, which really ends up getting you, depending on the individual year, in that same range. And so it's interesting, because by applying the CPI, we have managed to pretty much keep pace with the increase in provincial funding.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other speakers on my list, I will look to Trustee Blackburn for wrap-up.
None required, Madam Chair.
Okay, then I will call the question on the recommendation on folio 2. All those in favor? That carries. Great. Moving on to Special Education Advisory Committee minutes. Somebody'd like to move receipt? I'm drawing a blank as to who might have been there. Trustee Campbell wants to move receipt, maybe? People are pointing.
Move receipt? Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
Trustee Jennings, sorry. I was looking the wrong way. Would you like to move receipt? Yes. Okay. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, I will call the question on receipt. All those in favor? Great. Thanks. That carries. And then on to matters for discussion. Report 19-031, Learning Support Services Operational Review of the Process for Identification, Needs Assessment, and Placement. Director.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Superintendent Simmons, along with his team, are here to bring us through that discussion item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I am joined by System Principal Hannah and LSS Manager Kay. Beginning on folio 15, we've provided a discussion report as LSS is beginning our plans to conduct the operational review. You'll recall in October 2018, Board passed a motion directing staff to undertake an operational review, and at that time the motion emerged from discussions at COW and SEAC related to the understanding of the Identification, Placement and Review Committee process. Other concerns emerged regarding perception of inconsistent practices and the need for clarity regarding the assessment of student needs and the tiered approach to intervention. It's also important to note that these discussions also highlighted the interconnectedness between the emotional aspects of supporting a student with special education needs and the legislative requirements outlined by regulation. That's important to mention because it does, those elements do have an impact on how stakeholders respond and understand the processes. Item 3 highlights the specific motion for your reference, namely that LSS undertake an operational review of the process for identification, needs assessment, including the use of tiered interventions as a support for all students, and as identification and placement evidence, and placement for all exceptionalities. We feel that if we're going to engage in this work, it needs to be meaningful, timely, relevant, and able to provide some concrete steps moving forward. To that end, we've endeavored to keep the scope of the review tight, acknowledging that there are still other important aspects of the work to be done for future work. Further, in an effort to efficiently and effectively complete this work, we've decided to seek an external consultant through a request for proposal process. Anytime you do engage in an RFP process with an external consultant, the work's way better when you have a clear frame of reference and the scope is clearly and tightly defined. So in plain words, managing the scope creep of a project like this is critically important to ensure that we end up with a meaningful product at the end of this review. Page 17 provides a rough timeline for the operational review, but I do want to put an asterisk beside that because we will be reviewing that timeline along with our external consultant, whoever's successful in the RFP process, and we don't want to limit the influence that an expert with understanding in organizational processes may bring to the table. All that to say, we'll provide updates along the way, regular updates along the way. At the February SEAC meeting, SEAC engaged with staff in a collaborative exercise to identify key questions, goals, and deliverables, It was a pretty challenging evening. We worked hard together, but staff and SEAC were able to narrow the focus of each element of the operational review. I do think it's really important that we publicly acknowledge the work that SEAC did that evening in advising us in moving forward. It was truly a phenomenal evening, so I would like to acknowledge that consultation and contribution for this work. In that work, two clear things emerged. First, there's clear interconnections between the elements of the motion, and secondly, the order of the work needs to be shifted to put needs assessment, including the use of tiered approach to intervention, ahead of identification and placement, just in terms of how the work process rolls out. So that's the way we've presented it for you in the discussion report. In the focus area of needs assessment, the perception is that the tiered approach to intervention is not clearly understood by stakeholders. To that end, 4 key questions emerged from our consultation. What processes are used in the OCDSB to learn about individual student needs? What are the indicators used district-wide to determine that a student's needs are being met? What are the processes used with the district to provide and receive feedback to parents, guardians regarding a student's needs? And what indicators are used to measure the effectiveness of the current supports and processes used in engaging all students and families? In the focus area of identification, a central question emerged. What is the fundamental difference in the understanding of parents and staff regarding the IPRC process? In the absence of a shared understanding, challenges emerge with respect to consistency of practice and the operationalization of the process. We've included some potential goals and deliverables, but again, we really don't want to limit the outcomes of this work prematurely. In the focus of placement, in addition to the interconnectedness with the other focus areas, the following questions emerged. What information and data is considered to support a placement decision at an IPRC? What is the role of parents and guardians in the placement decision? What are the tools and resources to support consistency across the district? Finally, following the discussion we have tonight, LSS will be working with central teams to create an RFP to continue this work so that we can get the ball rolling in that area. Another element of the motion was to report back on what steps had been taken following the discussion in October. In addition to the ongoing work of our multidisciplinary teams working directly with school teams, we're continuing work on our updated and enhanced quality program indicators, which now highlights the full range of special education programs and services to support students from the regular classroom to specialized program classes. We've been invited to engage at principal operations meetings around the referral process, specific discussions around the programs and services for students with giftedness, the importance of engaging parents throughout the needs assessment and referral process, and the importance of clear and transparent communication with parents. Leveraging our time with learning support teachers, we reviewed those same key messages and collaboratively developed strategies for the LST to use in sharing the information back at their school. And finally, we've engaged a multidisciplinary team to take a look at our existing referral teams with a view to being more consistent across each of them. It is clear that this is a significant body of work to be completed, even with the assistance of an external consultant. The resource implications are highlighted there for you, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that there will be implications for the work plans of the LSS staff. And then finally, in closing on folios 21 and 22, we've provided some guiding questions to help structure the conversation this evening. Why is the review being undertaken? How do questions inform the fundamental purpose of the review? What are expected deliverables at the end? How does the structured consultation with SEAC and staff add value to the process? And how might an external consultant with expertise in operational processes inform the review? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you. So on folio 21, there's an indication that the estimated cost will be approximately $100,000. May I don't know who would answer this, but where is that coming from?
Madam Chair, that'll come out of the LSS operating budget.
That seems like quite a bit of money for our learning support services budget. Very much hoping that doesn't have a direct impact on students. You also further indicated, I understand you're hiring outside consultants, and it is a large amount of work, so that makes sense to me, even though I'm concerned about the cost and at what cost is the cost. But you did indicate that this will affect the work plans of LSS staff. So while you're doing this, what aren't you doing?
Madam Chair, this work will require the support from the senior team at LSS and possibly LSCs who are also supporting students at the school level. The external consultant will be able to advise a lot on process. Our staff will have to be there to be able to provide content expertise and knowledge of our current operational processes. So it could potentially limit the amount of time we have available to engage in other things that are also emerging as priorities at the same time.
Yeah, I just want to be on the record that that answer is very concerning to me.
Trustee Campbell.
Already, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. I was just looking at the difference between a strategic review and an operational review, and I suspect that most of my concerns are actually more to do with a strategic review than an operational review. But perhaps the staff present tonight could speak to that. So for instance, while indicators, measurement indicators have been mentioned as a possible discussion or research item in the report, typically my understanding is that KPIs, not QPIs, KPIs and strategic outcomes, measuring for effectiveness, accountability, etc., is not typically part of an operational review. And so I was wondering if I could get confirmation, disconfirmation, clarification from the staff in terms of how they understand the scope typically of operational reviews.
Madam Chair, I agree that is our understanding as well. We are looking to get a deeper understanding of what are the processes that are in place. We understand staff understand processes from a certain perspective. Other stakeholder groups understand those processes from a different perspective. So we're hoping to unravel the layers of that and to get a clear understanding and some direction moving forward about where we might be better able to align our understandings in relation to the 3 elements of the motion.
Great, thank you. I know that this started, it's history in the previous board, and I'll listen to the discussion. I'll just say, well, this may be very valuable work, and certainly if it improves communication with parent communities and decreases work for staff in the long run, et cetera, it may be well worthwhile as an investment. It may not touch, though, on matters near and dear to my heart, such as if we double our investment in EAs, what will we look at to measure to determine whether or not that investment was worthwhile? And does what we look at vary by exceptionality? Do you know what the purposes of exceptionalities are? Their emotional well-being, their cognitive well-being, the gifted exceptionality in particular perhaps may be a little bit ambiguous to me in that regard. But perhaps these are matters more for a strategic review. I note that in the staff report, staff refer to communication, clarification, perhaps improvement of practices and training in the classroom, and that kind of thing as kinds of topics that might be pursued. So anyway, I'll listen to the discussion. My only remaining question, through you, Madam Chair, is the way the motion was worded, and I can see that staff are being true to the motion, is that it's focused on exceptional students. Increasingly, of course, our students are not identified and are in the regular classroom, and I think that's a trend across Ontario. I know that SEAC is really tends to be focused on the identified students and exceptionalities. To what extent will your planned review deal with students who are not formally identified but need services in the regular system, and how they're serviced and how things are communicated to them, even though they may not be identified?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think those students would fall into the category around needs assessment in particular, and the tiered approach to intervention. So not having a fully fleshed out process that we'll do in collaboration with the external consultant, it would be my anticipation that those kinds of students would be captured in that area.
Thank you.
Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. As someone who co-authored the motion and strongly encouraged the operational review, I'm certainly pleased to see this report here tonight. I would say, though, based on what I just heard in response to a question from Trustee Campbell, that I think there might be a bit of a disagreement. In terms of an operational review, I very much see this as being an evaluation of a system, a process, and how it's planned, how it's performing, and how it can be optimized when it comes to the identification, the placement, needs assessment, and all those parts in between. And I very much see service delivery being a big component of that. And I think if you want to talk about service delivery, you have to talk about KPIs. You know, are you being able to identify someone within 6 months or 8 months? I think that being able to answer that question, at least at the board level, is fundamental, both in terms of resourcing and experts in financial resources, but also the expectations that we're setting for parents. So I very much see that being part of this operational review. And that's at a very macro level. But I also think below that, from an operational standpoint, we also need to consider the ability for it to be agile for the students. So once something is in place, you know, it's not rigid, that there's a mechanism for feedback, for constant improvement, because students aren't static. You know, as they learn and as their needs change, there needs to be a thought process around, how are our supports to them evolving at the same time. So it's not a process, at least at the student level, and that student-teacher engagement, that it's not static, it's not rigid. So I think there's an operational level or an operational component that is even more finite, which is student-driven. So I certainly hope that when we're undertaking this review, that we will look at it from a macro level in terms of planning, performance, and optimization, and that we will consider how we utilize benchmarks for improving delivery, but that we also take into account that, sort of student, how a decision is impacting a student's well-being and learning, and how that is being continually defined or refined within that larger process.
Okay, thanks for that. Trustee Lyra.
So page 18, second half of the page, there's a sentence that says, feedback provided through COW and SEAC discussions have highlighted the perception that the tiered approach to intervention is not clearly defined or understood by critical stakeholder groups. I think that sentence is a little bit patronizing, because I believe that there were members of SEAC who understood it and disagreed with it or wanted it to be analyzed. And so I'd like to sort of highlight that what has been brought forward, or the summary that you brought out of the discussions with SEAC, have left the voices that understood and wanted analysis of the tiered intervention or might have disagreed with the tiered intervention to be, have been left out of the review, or what's been brought forward to the committee. Can you speak to that?
I'm trying to find the sentence that you referred to on folio, or page 8, folio 18.
Page 18, the paragraph immediately under focus area : needs assessment, all underlined.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Madam Chair, through you, so our understanding in that feedback and the conversations that we had moving forward is that there are different levels of understanding. Particularly, I think it reflects back on the comment around the emotional aspect of some of this work and the regulatory legislative requirements of this work. So I think the intent of that sentence is to just acknowledge there is a perception that there is different understandings amongst the different stakeholder groups.
But that sentence in and of itself says that disagreement is based in a lack of understanding, not in a difference of belief or ideology. And so I'd like to think that when you undertake this operational review, that people are going to be looking at whether or not the tiered intervention system is in the benefit of students, because I think that was something that I heard very clearly from members of the SEAC.
Thank you.
Great. Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. When I help parents navigate special education system, it's usually through the IEP mechanism. And the ones that I've seen this year, and there's been a few of them, I don't think the IEP was serving either parents or the board and our staff well. I admit they're ones that parents are having trouble with. In looking at this report, I don't see the IEP mentioned there. So I guess a comment on what the expectations around this review will be in addressing, looking at, seeing how the IEP is being utilized in the board.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There isn't a component of a formal IEP review in this body of work at this time. That is something that we are going to have to look forward to, specifically related to IEPs. However, IEPs and discussions of IEPs will come up in the concept of needs assessment and the tiered approach to intervention, where those interventions are documented in the case of an IEP. So it won't form the major body of this work, focusing on the identification, needs assessment, including the use of tiered intervention and placement. But it is something that's on the LSS radar for work moving forward.
I'm disappointed to hear that, because I think the IEP is the linchpin around all of this. When you look at an IEP for a student in grade 12 who is LID or LD, and their reading level is like grade 2, and it's not stated in the IEP. There's nothing in the IEP that says by the end of this year we expect this student to be reading at a 2.5 grade level. I mean, this is where I advise parents that they need to have that in the IEP. Then they need to ask to work in partnership with the school so that the IEP says something like, to achieve this half grade increase in reading ability, there will be X service, X service, X service. Because all they had prior to that was services will be provided. I don't see how that helps. It doesn't help the parents. It doesn't help staff in understanding, and it certainly doesn't help us as a board to understand our resource needs. And I'll just finish off that there's a significant number of people who view the IEP and tiered intervention as a way of a resource allocation slowdown. We don't have waiting lists anymore, but we have these IEPs that aren't very clear on what kind of resources are being brought to meet the expected successes for a student. So I hope as we go forward we consider how important the IEP is in all of this, and how it's, and you may disagree with me, but I think it's the linchpin. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Madam Chair. Through you, I do think the context in which you described that situation is likely to emerge through our needs assessment work. Having said that, likely not to the level that we would be hoping to do in future IEP work moving forward. However, it could very likely come out. Certainly, we would want our interventions documented in IEPs, and if a parent has had the experience that you've described, that we would want to hear from that. And in that sense, the operational review might point to this is important work that needs to be done next.
Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. I have a couple of comments. I agree with Trustee Fisher that when we're doing all of this, we can't forget that really the purpose of this is not just to see what we're doing and then put it on the shelf in a booklet. The whole point of this is to make sure that our system is working for the people it should be working for. So it's working for the students, it's well understood by parents, and people can actually navigate this system and depend on things like, if my child is identified with an LD, they're going to be receiving the services that they need in X amount of time, not that we've identified the child and okay, great, we'll maybe get around to it. So I very much agree with Trustee Fisher that this has to be more than just we're looking at this. We also need to look at what is it going once, and I'm hoping part of this is what are best practices that we've seen in other places that we would like to incorporate into this, because we've seen that they're helping our teachers and they're helping our students, and we're building capacity and we're building transparency, and we're more able to bring families and parents into this understanding. And so I'm hoping as part of that whole process, what we're also seeing falling out of this are things like a bit of what Trustee Campbell has talked about, Do we have the resources, the kinds we need, the numbers we need? Because again, if all we're going to say is, this is what we think we need to do, but we can't understand how we're going to progress to get from where we are to where we would like to be, we need to have those kinds of questions answered. I understand what Trustee Lyra is trying to talk about around the tiered approach, but I know around this table for the past couple of years, we've heard a lot of concern and confusion around parents understanding what the tiering approach is, how does it help your child, what's the follow-up mechanism with that, is it linear, is it not linear, those kinds of things. So I believe those are all going to come out in this. When we talk about the focus area in placement, I think, again, one of the things that I'm looking for and hoping that we see throughout this whole review is, how do we get to a place where expectations, we have real expectations for parents, they're predictable, related to our system and what our placements are. I'll go back on the list, please.
Okay. Miss Handela.
Thank you. I am interested that I heard the word stakeholders, yet I don't see them identified in this report, and I don't see them identified in the action plan. So I have 4 questions, and I may go back on the list if I run out of time, but they're all trying to be recentering this on the parent and student experience. First, to follow up on the excellent point that Trustee Blackburn has raised, you've indicated that there's going to be a service redirection. How will that be quantified, and when will impacted parents know? So if you want to, maybe we'll do these one at a time.
Madam Chair, we will be taking a look at how the work that's involved on the part of staff in relation to the operational review weighs in terms of our overall work plan for next year. And we'll know more about that once we talk and develop a plan with our external consultant and what it's going to look like in terms of staff commitment moving forward.
I would hope that that turns into much more granular detail that could be socialized and informed, so parents can know. Over a year is a long period of time, and if people are going to be on a waiting list, they have a right to know about short-term impacts. Coming to the design perspective that was raised by Trustee Campbell, Trustee Fisher, operational strategic review, the end goal, as Trustee Boothby mentioned, is to understand what we do, understand how it's understood, and seek opportunity. In best practices in design, user-centered design is the modern approach to this. You bring the users into your review process, you understand not only what you do and deliver as service delivery agents, but you understand how that's perceived throughout the process. The actions here do not indicate any parent or participant involvement. Please explain if that's really a gap or how you plan to address that.
Madam Chair, it's absolutely not a gap. That'll be part of the RFP process, where we'll be turning to our external consultant for their best advice in terms of their submissions on what they think will go about meeting the goals of the operational review. We would fully expect that there has to be consultation, information, focus groups, what have you, with the various stakeholder groups, including parents, staff, and staff at all different levels in terms of their understanding, students if appropriate. So we anticipate in that RFP process that a prospective consultant would present for us, okay, so I understand what it is you need to do in terms of your operational review. Here are the key elements based on my experience in unwrapping operational processes within complex organizations, and here's what I think is going to help yield the data that you need in order to inform plans moving forward.
That's great, except that's not here. And a consultant will only do what you ask them to do, and if you don't identify user-centered design as a goal in this process, and it isn't even mentioned in your communication consultation issues section. So I think there's an opportunity to reflect your intent that was very well described better in your scope goals. The next thing is what's out of scope. That's not listed here as to what you're not going to try and target.
So that will also be part of the conversation that we'll have in developing the RFP. We'll be working with our supply chain management group to help guide us in the development of that RFP. Certainly we recognize the importance of defining what's out of scope. Things like full detailed IEP review are not within the scope of this. However, we do want to make sure we get at elements of the IEP related to needs assessment and parent, teacher, and student understanding of the accommodations that are put in place to support them.
Great. How will that RFP detail be brought in front of the decision makers in this room?
Madam Chair, that'll be work that we will undertake as staff, and sending that out for review through our distribution system for RFPs. So we will undertake that operational work as staff.
So to that point, as I've watched all of these motions and in this process change, a complaint, and it's a complaint that parents have brought to OCASC and to parent councils throughout all of these processes, is lack of transparency. Motions happen, reviews happen, people provide feedback, and reports are written, but there's no way to see minutes or documentation. And that is an opportunity that you have to work into this process now, to not have people have to wait an entire year to see what's happened. And to that point, how will you improve this process to be agile? What if something is discovered halfway through that is a game changer and means that the scope needs to change? How will, again, the people in this room get that feedback?
Madam Chair, part of the reason that we're going through this process right now with the committee is for that exact reason, so that if we do identify things like that that are game changers, we would absolutely bring that forward. What we don't want to do is get to the end of this process and come here and do the presentation and hear, well, that's not what we were asking for. So that's part of the reason we're having this conversation now, to avoid that. And if there are those game-changing moments that you describe, we will definitely bring them back to the committee.
Mr. Wiley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support this review. It's part of the evidence-based reporting that we'd like to see. And pretty well everything else I wanted to say was covered already at this point, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks very much to staff for this report. I was very, very pleased with the way that the structured discussion at SEAC went on the 25th of February. It was a very rich discussion and I think an extremely productive discussion, and I see it well reflected in the document in front of us. I think it's important to remember we are looking here at the scope. The methodology is another question that's going to emerge as part of the RFP. But here really we're trying to put a box around some of the questions that we see as wanting answers for, which really originated very much in questions that came forward about tiered intervention and anecdotes that suggested significant inconsistencies in how it was being applied and understood and explained and everything else. That meant for some people what seemed to be unconscionable waiting times for placements and so on. And it raised a lot of questions about a host of issues around needs assessment and identification and even placement within the context of SEAC discussions and discussions by trustees. That said, I think that the questions here, for the most part, have reflected very well what some of the big issues are that have emerged from those discussions. One thing that I'm not sure the meaning of is the last bullet question on folio 18 under the needs assessment, which asks what indicators are used to measure the effectiveness of the current supports and processes used in engaging all students and families. And that wasn't quite what I understood the issue to be, that it was not the effectiveness of the current supports and processes used in engaging the students and families, but rather how do we know, how do families know whether or not the supports and processes that are being used for their children are working? And I just would appreciate staff comment on that. Have I misunderstood, or is this sentence not clear?
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the comment. Certainly, I agree with you. I think our support's working is a much simpler way of phrasing that question. So I think the wording in it got awkward. There was also the piece around how are we engaging parents and guardians within all that work. So not only just are the supports working, but how are we engaging parents and guardians.
Thank you for that. I see it very much as how do parents know that the supports are working? Because that seems to be a question that has come up over and over again. And at what point, when we see them as not working, at what point do we look at a change of placement? So I think that's one thing that needs to be sorted. The other thing that I think is important to consider, which I don't see in this, is to provide some mechanism for coming to a common understanding of what we're talking about when we use the word program. We keep talking about placement in special education programs. And in this board, for a period of time, people used program to mean class, where at other times program has meant the how of delivering the curriculum wherever that happened to be taking place. And at the same time, we talk about the regular English program and the MFI program and the EFI program. So we use the word program in a lot of different ways. And I think one of the things that needs clarification here is when we are using it in the context of serving students who are identified as exceptional or who have special education needs. When we say program, what are we talking about? And I'm not sure where that exactly fits in the whole set, but I would appreciate staff comment.
Thank you for highlighting that, and I certainly know I've had conversations with the committee in the past around how we use some of these terms, identification, assessment, placement, program, and so on, in different contexts, and they mean different things. What we'll do is we'll take that back, and I think it's an important piece to bring into this conversation because it highlights an area that could potentially be confusing for parents, particularly, we've had challenges at meetings like this where learning support services staff use language in a certain context, but it's heard by trustees in a different context. So I think that will be an added value to the operational review.
Thank you. Could you put me back on the list, please?
You bet. Okay, that completes our first-time speakers. And Trustee Ellis, were you on the list again?
Thank you. I just would like it on the record. There's been some question as to the wisdom of spending the money on this review. I just want to say that I think this will be money well spent, that we're going to learn many things, not the least of which better communication where some of those deficits are and how we'll move forward with that, and that out of this we'll be able to understand the needs of students and brings resources to them in a quicker and more timely manner. So just wanted that on the record. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, and I'll echo Trustee Ellis's comments, and I also think another byproduct of this is it's going to give us all a lot more confidence in our system that we're actually doing what we say we're going to do and what the Education Act requires us to do for our students. So I'm going to move on to the concurrent work portion of your report. And so I'm looking under the professional development to principals, and I appreciate this section here that you've talked specifically primarily about gifted children. And I'm just wondering, and not just for gifted children, but I'm also wondering, how are we addressing in the system currently how we're finding non-typical gifted students? Because that's always one of the big concerns around giftedness is we have a demographic that we have, and that demographic seems to have fallen out of the way that we're identifying children, yet we know there has to be more children in unidentified groups that are in this exceptionality. So how are we moving forward trying to identify that?
Madam Chair, through you, certainly we identified that the research would indicate differential identification of various subgroups in giftedness. We've had conversations with principals, of all principals, whether you're a principal of a raised school, of a suburban school, a urban school, that there are gifted students within your schools. One of the other things that we are doing, and we'll have something coming forward shortly, is moving out to pilot our OCDSB guide for supporting the gifted learner in the regular classroom. That document does have a section on myths regarding giftedness. So that whole idea around, are there things that are masking the student's giftedness or that are a manifestation of the student's giftedness that are stopping you from seeing that it might be giftedness? So excuse me, there will be ongoing work in that as we continue that work through the guide to supporting gifted learners in the regular classroom.
Okay, thank you for that. That was my next question, so I'll ask the second half of that question. Where are we with respect to the rollout of the Interest Academy, or is that not under LSS?
Sorry, I was just checking if Superintendent Baker was here. It is joint work between LSS and Curriculum Services. We will be coming forward with a memo in May, I believe, talking about our initial pilots, and we're going to begin those in the fall, looking towards tweaking those resources before rolling them out in a more fulsome manner to the broader system.
Thank you for that. And my last question is, under this professional development to principals section, there's a bullet under the giftedness that talks about requests for the CCAT assessment. How do families make those requests?
Madam Chair, a family would make that request through the child's teacher or the LST at the school, who would then channel it through Learning Support Services, and we would facilitate that test, that assessment, sorry.
Thank you. That's all for me.
Great, thanks. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions left. Just going back to the scope of work and the references that have been made to key performance indicators and so on, I guess I don't see this as trying to apply key performance indicators and collect data, but rather to indicate where key performance indicators might potentially be developed and used, because right now we really don't have any. So I'll just leave that thought on the table and go on to my second question, which partly touches on the professional development for principals section, and that is in the scope of this work, I think one of the things we need to do, and perhaps we also need to include it in the professional development, is to make sure that when parents request an IPRC, which they have a legal right to do, that we are not ignoring those requests and that we are not saying no. And I hear both that they have been ignored and that they have received an answer no. While I appreciate that it can be important to make sure that that is in fact what the parent means when they make the request, nevertheless, the request needs to be respected. And so I think if there's any way through the scope of this work to determine whether or not those requests are being respected, that would be an important piece. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Great. Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just very briefly, back to Trustee Ellis's point about IEPs, which I would agree with 110%. I think one way of perhaps tackling this is that we know that it's through the identification placement process. That process can certainly lead to an IEP. So I think an IEP can at least be explored in that context, and perhaps as a subset of that, since we could be looking at IEPs as they relate to IPRCs, that could present an opportunity to at least do a brief evaluation of general IEPs without going into a much broader detail about general IEPs, but not omitting them, I think, from this process, because I do think that they certainly are an important part of the IPRC process, particularly the specificity and the detail that's contained in them. So that might be one way of getting to it without doing a much broader scope around IEPs. Food for thought. And then I guess the second comment that I would have is I'm always mindful about the role of reporting, the role of teachers, and the reporting requirements on teachers, IEPs, and God knows what else that they have to report on. I think it would be really interesting as part of this process to get their perspective on, how they relate to and manage IEPs, because when I look at the realm of reporting in the education sector, I will take a good IEP over some other, for lack of a better word, perfunctory reporting requirement any day. It's a trade for me. You give a very detailed IEP that's going to help a student with specificity and it's clear for parents, I will take that any day over, the laundry list of reporting requirements we might have. So I actually think it would be interesting to at least from the Federation standpoint, get their perspective in terms of the broad suite of reporting requirements that their employees are dealing with. How does this, sorry, I'm struggling here a little bit now. How, if we look at the process of formulating and implementing IEPs, is there a trade-off there somewhere? I'm not articulating this very well, but against all the other reporting requirements that we might be doing, right? So I think that's certainly something to consider, because I think a good IEP is perhaps something more beneficial for the board than perhaps other reporting requirements that we ask them to report on.
Okay, that takes me to the end of my speakers list for this item. And we are going to take the 9 o'clock break at this time before we go into our next discussion item. And I will suggest that break be no more than 5 minutes, please. Thanks. And that concludes our 5-minute break. Not even quorum in the room. What's wrong? What? Oh, it came out. Yeah. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. There's not even quorum in the room. Oh, there is. Okay, we have quorum in the room, so I will call us back to order. And we are moving on then to report 19-022, employee well-being and absenteeism. Director?
At this point, I will invite Superintendent Janice McCoy and her team to take us through this discussion item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in an effort to provide an overview of the report, we have prepared a PowerPoint, which is up on the screen. And I also want to indicate that I'm joined here this evening by Manager Lemeister, and I want to acknowledge her contribution as well. So, and this is always a challenge when I need my glasses to see far away. Start by talking about what we mean when we talk about employee well-being, and it refers to an overall health of individual employees, including physical, mental, and social aspects of overall health. We know that employee well-being has been identified through our strategic plan as a strategic priority, and that as a district and an employer that we have certain responsibilities when it comes to employee well-being, which includes taking steps to promote a healthy lifestyle and personal choices. That's often through the provision of resources and access to other information. Providing a workplace that supports physical and psychological health and well-being of all of our employees. And finally, by removing any barriers to physical and psychological health and well-being, including identifying and addressing adverse working conditions. In terms of absenteeism specifically, the data indicates that there is an increase in overall absenteeism across school boards in Ontario. With regard to our own statistics, the OCDSB average annual sick leave for permanent employees has increased over the last 5 years from an average of 8.61 days to 12 days. And we know that contributes, has an impact in a number of ways, including on our classrooms, in our schools, and in our central departments. One of the specific impacts that has created significant concerns more recently is related to the availability of replacement staff, and we know that that has become a challenge in our schools in terms of ensuring that when an employee is absent, that there is a replacement person in behind, whether that's a teacher, an educational assistant, or an ECE. As we look at the issue of employee absenteeism and some of the potential contributing factors, we know that generally there is an increase in terms of mental health concerns, and those are attributable to both workplace and non-workplace factors. As we look at our statistics, particularly around long-term disability, we know that mental health concerns is one of the leading reasons why employees are on long-term disability. We also look at what are some potential workplace stressors that may be contributing to increases in employee absenteeism. Some of the specific issues that have been identified through our discussions with our Federation representatives and our principals and vice principals include things such as increased workload and increased expectations, an increase in student behavior challenges. Also thinking back to the stress that's been caused by the lack of replacement staff availability is another specific stressor that's been identified, particularly among our principal and vice principal group. As well, we consider the significant changes that were made to the sick leave program approximately 5 years ago, and the increase in the number of sick leave days that are available to staff, as well as the change in terms of the ability to accumulate unused days and the potential impact that that's had on and around absenteeism. As we look at the issue and in terms of some of the programs and supports that we have in place, we know that it's important to ensure that we have a comprehensive program in place that includes three elements of attendance management and support, disability management, and wellness initiatives. And within the OCDSB, responsibility for the implementation of these programs resides within Human Resources in the Employee Wellness and Disability Management Division. However, having said that, we also know that employee well-being needs to be an organizational imperative, that it can't be solely the responsibility of any single person or division to ensure that we are paying attention to factors that impact on employee well-being. Looking more specifically at the different programs we have in place, starting with our attendance support program. The focus of the program is on sporadic absences, and specifically non-culpable or innocent absenteeism versus long-term continuous absences. The intent of the program is to support employees who are having difficulty for various reasons maintaining regular attendance at work. The program uses a threshold of 11 days of absence, which triggers a review to determine whether or not the employee is eligible to be enrolled in the attendance support program. And it is centrally monitored and managed through a position in Human Resources. And interesting to note that since September 2018, over 360 employees have been identified as meeting the 11-day threshold. That's not to say that all of those employees have been enrolled, but have at least met the 11-day threshold and have been reviewed in terms of determining whether or not they should be enrolled in the attendance support program. Turning to disability management, it is specifically intended to provide support to employees who are experiencing a longer-term absence, and the threshold that we use is any absence that's greater than 5 days requires medical support and would come to the attention of our disability management coordinators. The focus is on supporting employees who are experiencing an illness, a non-workplace injury, or chronic absences due to a disability, and whether that is a temporary or more permanent disability. And part of the focus is on, wherever possible, identifying suitable workplace accommodations that will help the employee to return to or stay at work and reduce the absence duration. In addition to the attendance support and disability management program, there are also proactive programs in place to support employee health and wellness, and specifically initiatives to promote positive lifestyle practices, which we referred to earlier. So, for example, through our employee and family assistance program, smoking cessation programs, information to promote healthy nutrition and exercise practices, other programs to support healthy and safe workplaces and to prevent workplace injuries, largely managed through our Occupational Health and Safety Division and the Joint Health and Safety Committee, and as well to look at workplace climate issues, psychological and social support specifically for employees. Some of the specific programs and initiatives that we have in place are a Leading Mentally Healthy Workplaces program, which we have been providing to supervisors and managers over the last couple of years. Our goal is to ensure that all of our supervisors, managers, and principals are provided with this training, which is designed to provide a greater awareness of mental health in the workplace and to provide leaders with strategies that they can use to support employees who may be exhibiting behaviors that may be indicative of a mental health concern. The goal is to be preventative wherever possible and to support employees so that they can stay at work or can return to work in short order. In addition, we have our Employee and Family Assistance Program, which currently is provided through Morneau-Chappelle, a short-term childcare program, which is intended to provide employees with short-term support in the event that their own childcare measures are unavailable. We have our Joint Health and Safety Committee and the subcommittees attached to that. In addition, about a year ago, we established a committee which includes representation from all of our federations and principals, vice principals, as well as representation from some of our central departments, including human resources, our mental health lead, and communications. And that's our Engaging and Healthy Workplace Committee. And largely through that committee, but elsewhere as well, we are working toward implementation of the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace by examining the 13 factors that are part of that standard and specifically how we can move towards ensuring that any barriers that are currently in place and negatively impacting on psychological health and safety can be addressed. In summary, as we know from the statistics, our sick leave data, our sick leave continues to increase across all employee groups in the district. It's attributable to various factors, including workplace factors that have been shared with us by different employee groups and through our own observations. We have programs in place through our attendance support program, our disability management program, and our wellness initiatives that are designed to not only reduce absenteeism, but also to provide employees with support as they need it so that they can stay at work. And there are ongoing efforts underway to identify and address some of these contributing factors. Each of the programs that are identified we're always undertaking a continuous improvement, looking for ways that we can continue to improve each of those programs so that they are serving our employees in a better way. And those efforts will certainly continue. And I believe now we are happy to take questions, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you for that. Trustee Boothby.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the really good report. Lots of great information in here. My first question, and I see CFO Carson is still here, and maybe this is a question for him. Under the GSNs, how much are we given through GSNs to support the 11 days of sick leave, and has that amount gone up at all since 2012?
Thanks, Madam Chair. The funding model generates about $10 million a year to support supply teacher costs. They're the only two categories that actually have a designated amount. And the only increase that we've seen has been the wage rate increase associated with that. It hasn't changed to reflect usage.
Okay, thank you for that. My other questions are around Folio 25, where we're talking about the challenges that we're having around occasional teachers. And I see here in the second paragraph, we talk about designated occasional teachers for particular schools or groups of schools, I'm guessing that is. Can you tell me what percentage of schools that we're needing to do this for?
So through you, Madam Chair, we started the DOT program during the 17-18 school year, and we continued it this year. So as of October of 2018, we reached out to elementary schools, and I think with very few exceptions, all of our elementary schools were assigned a designated occasional teacher. And in some cases, schools were allocated more than one DOT. In addition to providing support to that particular elementary school, the DOTs are redeployed if they are not needed in their assigned school to neighboring schools who may be experiencing an unfilled absence for the day, and that redeployment occurs through centrally through human resources.
Okay, that sounds like really good news to me. So has that reduced the number of occasions where either the principal and or the vice principal have had to fill in for absent teachers?
Through you, Madam Chair, the feedback that we've received from our administrators is certainly that the DOTs have had an impact. Doesn't mean, though, that our schools aren't continuing to experience challenges, in particular related to absences of ECEs and EAs, where we continue to experience more significant difficulty with replacements. Notwithstanding the fact that we have we've left those postings open and are seeking to add to our casual pools on an ongoing basis through the school year.
Okay, so that last comment you made, is that basically telling me that we couldn't do a DOT type thing with ECEs and EAs, that we just don't have enough casual to do such a thing?
So we currently do have, I think it's between 6 and 8 positions that are identified as ECE floater or replacement positions, and we've had those for several years, but we have difficulty keeping them filled. And it's largely attributable to the fact that we have a turnover among our regular ECEs, and so our focus has been on filling our regular assignments or our term assignments in the case of longer term absences. And so given that we're having difficulty keeping those filled, it doesn't make sense that we would increase, although we are looking at ways that we can, in fact, try and use those in a more effective and efficient way. We are looking at the possibility of replacement EAs as well, so similar to a DOT model, although unlikely that we would be assigning one to every school, but rather looking at schools that might have a higher proportion or a higher number of EAs assigned. But we are continuing to have difficulty, again, finding, recruiting, attracting EAs to some of our term positions, and so again, that remains our focus, but we haven't ruled out the possibility of looking at something similar to the DOT model for other employee groups.
Okay, thank you. And in the rest of that paragraph where you talk about more permanent changes to the terms and conditions, is that more in line with the attracting and retention of ECEs and EAs, or is it across all three of the groups, teachers, ECEs, and EAs?
It would be across all groups. So looking at collective bargaining, looking at our collective agreements, and looking at either things that might be barriers or looking for opportunities in terms of changing terms and conditions that would make it more attractive. We know, for example, that our casual rate for EAs is fairly substantially lower than the casual rate for EAs at our neighboring board, although our regular salary rates are higher. And so while we have a hard time attracting casuals, we know that on a permanent basis, we're more attractive. And so looking at those kinds of things and trying to address those through bargaining, and that's just one example.
Thank you. And I guess my last question is, so in some of these schools where we have ECEs and or EAs calling in sick and we can't get a casual, who's backfilling in those positions? Is it principals, vice principals, or are we combining classes, or?
So through Madam Chair, there are a range of strategies that are looked at in schools. So for example, it may be a principal or a vice principal who fills in for all or part of the absence. It may be, in the case of EAs, for example, looking at the pool of EAs in the school if there's more than one, and potentially reassigning for the day based on the nature of the assignments and whether or not that kind of change can be made. It could involve using emergency replacements. So for example, schools have use their lunch monitors or other staff who they are familiar with and who principals have confidence can come in and, at least on a temporary emergency basis, fill those positions. So those are some of the strategies that we know are used in schools.
Okay, and I do have one more question. Are we having, or are we experiencing any exclusions of children based on sick leave for EAs?
Through Madam Chair, not that I'm aware of. So it wouldn't be our practice, for example, to ask a student or ask parents to keep a student at home because the EA is not present. And so I'm not aware of any situations where an exclusion has occurred because there is because of an absence.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Trustee Lyra.
So you mentioned in the PowerPoint, I believe, that 360 people took sick leave, and that as soon as you hit 11 days of sick leave, you were automatically, can you elaborate on the program? I've forgotten the name and I didn't write it down.
So through you, Madam Chair, that's part of our attendance support program. And so again, it's a program that's designed to address frequent absences. So employees who, based on their absence trends, have difficulty attending on a regular basis. We identified 11 as our threshold, which means that when an employee is absent for 11 days, then our attendance management coordinator will look at the employee and determine whether or not they should enter the program. And some of the considerations would include, was it a single continuous absence, in which case it wouldn't qualify because really the program is designed to support employees where there are sporadic absences. It also wouldn't apply if the employee wouldn't be enrolled in the program if they were being treated for a chronic disability, which is being managed already through our disability management division or through a disability management coordinator. And so there may be a number of reasons why an employee, even though they've hit the 11 days, wouldn't necessarily be enrolled in the program.
My understanding is that employees have usually more than 11 sick days in a year? 11 and then 120 short-term disability days, right?
That's correct.
Given, and that everybody, all 360 people, as soon as you hit that 11-day threshold, you're automatically referred. So there were 360 people at the board who took 11 sick days in the last year.
So, Madam Chair, I believe it was 360 had used more than 11 days since September 1st of 2018. Our sick leave and other leave allocations are allocated on a school year basis, and so the balance would be refreshed as of September 1st.
Do you happen to have the number offhand for 2018-2019 or for 2017-2018?
I don't have the number in terms of the number of employees who used more than 11 sick days. I don't have the number with me, but that is information that we would have available.
Okay, so the reason I ask is if we're only hitting 360 people a year who take the full 11 sick days, that's half of a percentage of our total staff, and that seems like less of an issue that has been made out to be. If the number is substantially higher than that, I would love to know. I have a question. So earlier it was we were told that the OCDSB had for a number of years been below the provincial average in terms of sick days taken. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's correct based on the time that based on the period of time that we have available.
So given that we are below the provincial average, but now we are raising quicker than the provincial average, is it possible that we are simply renormalizing to the average?
Through Madam Chair, that's certainly possible. We know that we've been increasing our sick leave usage in some groups in particular has been increasing at a faster rate than the comparators in other districts.
So the reason I ask is if we were below the provincial average for a long time, and now we're raising quicker than the provincial average in terms of sick days, it's possible, I would think it possible that the reason we are raising quicker is because we are getting closer to the provincial average compared to the other people who are going up. And I just wanted trustees to think about that when we look at the increase in sick days. I have a question. Earlier it was mentioned that ECEs have a higher rate of sick days, and one of the reasons mentioned is perhaps because they have earlier starts and they have later starts. So they have like a morning, they start much earlier than an average teacher, and they end later, or they end later. It's sort of one or the other. Can you talk about that for a moment?
So through you, Madam Chair, I'm not sure whether or not our sick leave usage for ECEs relative to the provincial average is significantly higher. However, we know that the number of days used by our ECEs has been increasing at a fairly rapid rate relative to other groups. And I think there are maybe different contributing factors to that. Part of it may be the hours of work, as the trustee indicated. We know many of our ECEs, because they are assigned to EDP in the morning, are starting very early, and then we have other ECEs who are required to work beyond the school day day in terms of covering the extended day program. So that could be a factor. We know that given the given the expectations around that may be a contributing factor, but it's difficult to say with certainty. It's certainly one of the things that differentiates our ECE hours of work from those that are in place in most other boards where their hours of work really align more closely with the school day.
Do other boards not have early ECE programming, or do their early start day programs not have ECEs?
So through you, Madam Chair, there are relatively few boards that operate their own extended day programs, and those that do, that we're familiar with, staff those programs separately. So for example, the ECEs who are assigned to their kindergarten would not necessarily also be assigned to cover EDP, but rather they engage separate employees to cover the EDP program before and after school.
My time is almost up, so I'm going to like to go back on the list, please, and thank you.
Okay. Trustee Campbell.
Thank you very much. Fascinating report, good discussion. We'll see if I can do this in the time allotted. I may have to go back. Throughout the report, there were many sections of the report, in particular on folio 24, but elsewhere, I believe, there are a number of possible reasons adduced. I'm thinking folio 26 as to why we may be seeing some of these increases. Changes in level of aggression on folio 26. We have lack of consistency in student discipline, erosion of professional judgment, professional autonomy, increased workload demands, general expectations of members, etc. And we see some of these possible reasons in several sections throughout the report. We've heard a lot about that. It's across Ontario, maybe even across Canada in some regards. Some of it may be beyond our control. These changes, I gather, are more or less coincident with the collective agreement changes, so it's maybe difficult to disentangle some causal factors here to a certain degree. And so it's a complex matter, and I think I get that. But two things really jump out at me, and some trustees have already asked some questions around that. And one is the ECE group, and the other is the custodians maintenance group for me. So by my math, I stand to be corrected, over the 5 years, I see an 85% jump in the ECE absence compared to the general average, which is down in the 30s. So to me, this is just a huge, startling number, and that's an increase. It wasn't that way at the beginning. And it's increased from year to year. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's a narrative behind that, especially because that's, in a sense, way out of whack with the rest of the average. The other group I'd like potentially a comment with respect to is the custodians maintenance folks, because a lot of the reasons mentioned in the report, aggression in classrooms, lack of professional autonomy, or maybe it does extend, there's less professional autonomy with respect to custodians, for all I know. But it seems to me that a lot of the possible reasons set out in the report don't really apply to that category, and yet they're pretty much at the same level of increase over the 5 years in terms of the usage. So I was wondering if I could get a staff comment with respect to those two groups, which seem to me, in a sense, to be lacking some explanation or outliers.
Through you, Madam Chair, speaking first to the ECEs, and although the rate of increase may differ among boards, what I can say is that certainly ECEs tend to have the highest average in other boards as well, and I think it may go to as well some of the nature of the work. For example, working in our kindergarten classes in terms of, at times we hear it's around the professional relationship in terms of the interactions with, in close proximity, working closely with a teacher and other staff, and that sometimes it's as a result of that stress. So what we don't have are comparable figures for elementary teachers, specifically in kindergarten, and whether or not the data for that group may also be high. So it's difficult to say whether or not it's ECEs in particular, or whether or not it's attached to kindergarten, and we may see the same thing in terms of our elementary teachers assigned to kindergarten classes. In the case of custodian and maintenance, one of the factors it may be related to age, that if we look at our groups, it's an employee group that I think generally is older, and also given the nature of the work that they do in terms of it being physical largely, and so the impact particularly for an older population, we may be seeing it in terms of the increased or higher absentee rates.
Thank you.
Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for the report. I certainly echo my colleagues' comments so far. You know, I guess just a general comment on the report, you know, which we see every year. You know, I guess it's an understatement to say we're a people business. You know, obviously, our custodians are keeping our schools open, and our teachers, EAs and ECEs, if they're not thriving, I think it's fair to say that our students aren't learning, and if our students aren't learning, they're not succeeding. So I think about, you know, all the things that are in this report and our strategic plan that's about to come. You know, this needs to be, you know, at the core of everything that we're thinking about as an organization, because if we're not getting our people right, we're not getting the board right, fundamentally. And I do like the point that Trustee Campbell made about what do we control, what do we don't control, and of the things that we do control, you know, how are we making sure that we're putting in place the right initiatives, the right conversations, and making a concerted effort to really hit these issues head on. And I guess that's where my question is, because, you know, every year we have a great discussion about the report, the statistics, and I think if you look at the trend over at least the time that I've been on this board, it's worrying. It's going up. It's not going down. And so whether it's the working group we have with the federations on absenteeism, whether it's the work we're doing around healthy, engaging workplaces and mindfulness and wellness, you know, how are we as a board, how are you as staff, how are we really going to get ahead of this curve within the next year, within the next 4 years? Because I honestly don't want to be having this conversation again next year or the next 4 years, and all we're doing is saying, oh, it's gone up another 10%, right? And I'm not trying to, you know, suggest that these things are simple. They're not. But I think we have to be very real about it and put some real dollars to it and some real attention to it. You know, if we're going to arrest this increase in this worrying trend that I see. So I'm just curious to know from you, you know, what is the plan? And, you know, what are some of the biggest concerns you're hearing from the working committees we have in place, and how are we putting things in place to address those, and how are we funding those?
Through you, Madam Chair, and I think we would agree with Trustee Fisher's comments that the continuing trend is of concern. It's certainly a concern not only among our senior team within this district, but we know across the province, and something that we continue to think about in terms of how are we going to turn the corner on what has been sort of a trend over the last 5 years. No easy answers, certainly, in terms of some of the challenges that we see. And as both Trustee Campbell and Trustee Fisher noted, that there are things that are within our control and things that aren't. If we think about what, from a psychosocial perspective, has the most impact on our employees, it's directly related to the conditions that they're working in at the school, and we know that the people that can have the biggest impact on that are often our principals and vice principals, who over the last at least year, if not longer, have been dealing with the impact of the unfilled vacancies, which we hear continuously from them is impacting in a whole number of ways. So that has been a focus for us over the last little while, and as recently as our last planning session with senior staff, we devoted half of our time to looking at that issue in terms of what some of the impacts are, but also what some of the strategies are that we can be looking at moving forward. And some of them are listed here, and some of them there's a greater list than that. But we recognize that until we start to address that problem, it makes it even more difficult to then focus on providing our school leaders and other managers and supervisors with the tools that they need to be able to create the kinds of conditions in our schools and departments that will really make a difference in terms of improving the climate or addressing factors that might be adversely impacting. In terms of what we hear from our Federation partners, both in our committee meetings and in other settings, largely, and we know that a couple of them are here, and I'm sure would be happy to weigh in. But some of the concerns that we've heard from them are those that are addressed the increasing challenging behaviors that we're seeing in many of our schools, as well as some of the concerns around strategies to try and address those behaviors. And so again, that's been another area of focus for us, not only in terms of providing professional learning for our principals and others, but also looking at the programs that we have in place and the supports we have in place and how we can leverage those to be more responsive in terms of building capacity among staff, but also ensuring that we have the right supports in the right places. So for example, that's included things like working very closely with Superintendent Simmons and his team as we look more closely at some of the aggressive incident reports that we get through our new online reporting system, looking at trends at schools and what's in place at those schools and what additional supports might be put in place. So again, trying to look at what some of the stressors are that have been identified and ensuring where we can that we are trying to be more responsive and looking ahead how we can be in a more proactive way, trying to invest resources, for example, early in the year in terms of supports being focused on some of the schools and classes where we know there are some of the biggest challenges, and putting those in place early as opposed to waiting until things are at a crisis point and we have staff going on leave. So those are some of the things that that we've been doing and that we will continue to do as we try to become more targeted in addressing some of the concerns.
I appreciate that. That was very thorough, and I certainly hope with the upcoming budget, but also future budgets and the strategic plan, that we really do as a board try to put a much clearer focus on trying to address this issue, because I think that's a number one priority of the board. And I think just to close about the comment that was made about EAs and absentees, student absenteeisms, I can tell you within the last 3 weeks, I've probably received 5 phone calls from parents to say that they have a child who has an EA, there are behavioral issues, and when that EA is not there, they can't deal with the behavior issues because of progressive discipline, and the child, having these issues time and time again, they're being sent home. So I know for a fact that they're happening, and that's probably across 1 or 2 schools that I'm aware of, and I can't imagine what the number is across the district. So I know it's happening, and it's something that we need to be mindful of, because that's putting pressure on parents as well.
Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. So a lot of these changes are being sort of thought of taking place when the way we do sick days was changed back in 2012, I guess. Has there been, and it's the accumulated component that was taken away that I hear quite often as a possible reason. Is there, I guess, a staff comment on whether going back to allowing some accumulation, do they think that would be a way of helping alleviate the sick leave that we see?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think it's difficult to predict whether or not that would have any positive impact. I think it's certainly something that that has been discussed as a possibility. I think certainly the fact that the ability to accumulate was taken away was seen as a negative by employees who previously could carry it forward and who could bank sick days, so that in the event that they did incur a long-term illness, that they would have that sick time available to them.
You have mentioned workplace factors. Is one of those factors class composition?
Through you, Madam Chair, the factors I was referring to are the factors in the national standard specifically, and so they're not specific to school boards. They're really more general factors that were identified in the work putting the standard together, that were identified as having an impact on the psychological health and safety of a workplace. So they include things like, for example, workload management, work-life balance, reward and recognition. I'm drawing a blank on the others, but those kinds of things. So class size composition wouldn't have been one of the factors in this standard.
We hear, aggressive behavior is, and obviously I know the stress that must put our staff under. We do have, our English program is overrepresented with special needs children, with newcomers. I'm just wondering if the board has taken a look at, that school classroom composition, and might there be correlation between that and sick days as well?
So through you, Madam Chair, what we do know is if there are particularly challenging situations in some schools, and if those are related to student behavior, for example, we do know that there is often a higher level of sick leave in those schools, particularly if we're unable to provide the supports in as timely a way as we might like. So certainly there's no question. However, I can also say that often as part of organizing a school, that principals, if they're aware when they're organizing it that there may be a student who has some difficulties managing his or her own behavior, that's part of what they consider as they put classes together to the extent that they can. It's also something that is considered not necessarily whether or not a student has behavioral challenges, but certainly looking at a range of factors as senior staff and HR looks at the allocation of staff through the academic staffing process, as well as the allocation of other resources that are approved later through the budget.
Thank you. I'll just make a comment. I know you can't draw a correlation, but when you look at the ECEs, I think that pretty well was when we implemented the 50-50 English bilingual, and we saw larger classes through that process. Can't hear me? Okay. Question. At the bottom of page 7, I don't know what the folio, page 29, you mentioned healthy, engaging workplace committee that states there will be a recommendation to the Director's Executive Council. Will those recommendations be shared with the trustees?
Through you, Madam Chair, it may depend on the nature of the recommendations. So to the extent that they go to operational issues that, that don't impact on policy, they may not come to the board for approval necessarily, but could certainly be shared as part of a future report. However, if they are recommendations that, for example, do go to policy or involve resources so that they might form part of a budget initiative, then they would come forward in that context.
Thank you, and got time for one more question, and you may not be able to answer it at this point, and it's around the designated occasional teachers, the DOT program. I've heard some of the participants in that program are facing challenges of getting to schools if they're moved to a different one, and I guess if you could comment on how many, what is the sort of, I'm out of time. What is the range of schools that they go to, and will there be an evaluation of that program brought forward?
So through you, Madam Chair, one of the changes we made this year relative to last year was we reduced the geographic zone in terms of the distance between schools that we would ask a designated occasional teacher to be redeployed to. That may be something that we look at again moving forward to next year. We know that particularly if there are schools that have different start and stop times, that can present some challenges for our DOTs who may not get notice of that they're being redeployed until shortly before a school starts, particularly if it's an early start school and they're generally assigned to a later start school. So it's not a perfect system, but certainly is an improvement, and we will be evaluating it before we as part of moving forward into to next year to see what changes we can make to make it a more effective program, and also to ensure that we are continuing to attract occasional teachers who want to move into those positions.
Ms. Bailey.
Thanks. I think this report acknowledges what a complex and difficult issue staff wellness and attendance is. And we'd like to acknowledge the fact that we've been working together with the board on a number of approaches to try to improve the situation. But I would like to give you a perspective from my members, the TBU secondary, which doesn't have the highest number here, but certainly would give you a sense of, from my perspective, why people might be accessing sick leave. We've heard quite a bit already about the lack of consistency around student discipline. We hear about that in every single school that we go to. It's a huge concern, and that can go to policy. So perhaps that would come here. We're seeing increases in reports around aggressive and violent behaviors. This afternoon I asked the officer in our office who deals with that, and she said that there have been about 2,400 aggressive incident reports from OSSTF members so far this year. And those aren't all hugely severe, but some of them are. The severity is on the rise. People are feeling that there are no significant actions that are taken after the reports, and they're expressing frustration. Just today, I was emailed and asked to attend a branch meeting at a school later this week to discuss staff safety and violent student behavior. We get regular calls from members that are concerned for their own safety and that of students. And what we're talking about is people being punched, kicked, spat upon. Sometimes serious injuries are incurred, sometimes people are hospitalized. That's not typical or common, but it has happened, and there is a lot of anxiety about that. The next thing I'd like to point out is that student absences create their own set of workload challenges for teachers. One of the reports that the board provided said that 47% of students were absent for 11 days or more in 2017 to 2018. And the average in secondary is 15 days of student absence. So if you think about that, that would be an awful lot of students that would be managed under an attendance support program in our board. 47% of the total number of students, that's a huge number of people if we were transferring that concept. The erosion of professional judgment, autonomy, and increased workload are also hugely connected for teachers, especially with assessment and evaluation. That also goes to policy and perhaps could come here, I'm not sure. I think marked deadlines, exam days, and all of that are a huge tipping point for secondary teachers. And the last point I'd make is that there's a really interesting correlation between the increase in the number of outstanding or new grievances and the number of sick days taken. So this is also a staff report that was provided, and the graph talks about an increase in 30% of outstanding or new grievances from 2014 to 2018. That's not to say that every grievance results in a sick day, but there's a general malaise and a sense of frustration that can be contributing to a decrease in wellness. So we really do appreciate working with the board and trying to find some solutions. We have some concrete suggestions, and we look forward to trying to create that shift that is referenced at the end of this particular report.
Great, thank you. Trustee Huff.
Well, at this point in the game, I'm echoing the sentiments that have been expressed around the table. And I would like to thank Superintendent McCoy for her work on this and her incredible answers here this evening. You've done a very good job of fielding all of these questions as they've come up. My original point that I was going to make when I was asking to be put on the speakers list was to speak to Trustee Lyra's comments about the ECEs and about the sick days being impacted by the early starts and the late finishes. And I think that that was the nugget that started the conversation about thinking about, this is not about something that is static. This isn't that early start time, the late end of the day did not start 5 years ago. It started long before that. So what we need to look at is, during this time period, what have been substantive changes to program, to policy, whether it is collective bargaining agreements or whether it's changes in the kindergarten composition. We've got to look at the underlying variables here that have changed over the course of this time, not just the change over time. And that, I feel very confident that staff is actually starting to really dig into that, and I encourage the federations to continue to give that feedback from the floor, what's going on in the schools. We don't know, we don't see the violent behaviors going on in classrooms. I don't want to see that. So that sort of feedback definitely needs to come into play, and we need to look at what shifts in policies and procedures are feeding into those situations. So no comment required. I just wanted to hear myself speak tonight.
Thank you. Ms. Handela.
Thank you. I have a couple of different perspectives. First off, and this is, thank you, Trustee Lyra, for a comment, because I want to drill down a little bit. Am I understanding correctly that based on folio 27, 25% of the district's workforce were absent for 11 days or more on sick leave?
That's correct.
So that means, by inference, 75% of board staff were less than average. So 25% of staff were your average and above, and 75% were less than average. Is that fair?
I think that's the correct conclusion, yes.
So could you tell me what the minimum, maximum, and the mean for each of these classifications were? Because averages are not helpful when a quarter of your population is above an average. What's the mean for each of these? What's our frequency? What's our distribution on these? Because one person having cancer can throw your stats off. How many? Let me get my questions a little bit more specific. What portion of the workforce took 0 sick days?
So through you, Madam Chair, I don't have that information with me this evening, but we do have that information available, and it could be provided.
So I think there's a lot in this report. There's a lot of intention in this report, but the analysis and the ability to drill down to challenges is far from presenting a table of averages. What isn't here is what this means in a classroom setting. What isn't here is the seasonal adjustment for these dates. Do we have a huge load of sick leave happening when our classes are hitting temperatures of 35 degrees? Do we have it because of infrastructure issues where people they just can't face another day? I can't separate, as a parent in this, I can't separate what this means for our classroom experience for our children. And I say this with a little bit of passion because my son experienced last year a series of teachers because we had a long-term absence in the class. So over my son's grade 1 experience, he had 3 buckets of teachers. Grade 1 was a write-off for him. I don't know what the long-term implications of that are going to be. The next question I have, though, is when you have a long-term absenteeism identified in a classroom, how are parents informed? Because I can tell you, I've never been told when a teacher's been away, except for when my kid comes home one day and says, we haven't had the same teacher for 2 weeks. We are missing the link from your big picture numbers to the classroom experience. And I don't know how to change this reporting to get to that, because in doing that, you'll find where your problems are. And the last thing I'm going to say in my 25 seconds is I'm a cancer survivor and a long-term lung, and I've had pneumonia recurrently because of an issue my kid brought home from school. It's so easy to get to 11 days. You have 1 surgery and you've hit 10 because standard medical practices have changed over 5 years. This isn't about policing absenteeism. It's about making sure the sick people have the support they need and you budget for it accordingly so your classrooms are healthy. Because if a teacher is sick in your classroom, the 30 kids and the 30 kids who are 5 years old are experiencing their own stresses if your ECEs are sick enough to be stressed. And we need to change the classroom experience, not just our averages.
Okay. Ms. Kettle. Thank you. So I just wanted to address the absences that are not filled. So the experiences our teachers have, and it may be similar in high school, I'm not sure, but if there's a shortage of EAs for the day, EAs can be pulled from, I'm going to give you an example, from a systems class. So if there is a congregated class, I have heard that an EA will be pulled from that class to go and work in other high needs areas. If an ECE is not absent for the day, they're not always replaced right away. So I know there is an effort to do so, but there are times when the teacher is alone in the class when an ECE is absent. When teachers are absent, they are filling in, so teachers may have to give up their prep time to fill in for those absences. Also, your LST, LRTs, and ESL teachers may have to go in and fill in for those absences, and that means children not getting supports for that day. So we know it's a huge concern, and we know it's a concern across the province. I haven't heard of combining classes. I'm not sure if that's happening or not. Definitely we are seeing, or we are hearing in the office, an increase in aggressive behaviors, absolutely contributing to the stresses for teachers. And we've talked about that before, we've mentioned that before. Absolutely, I think about myself when I was teaching in the classroom and during the H1N1 epidemic. And I got the flu and then I got pneumonia. So there are times when you have those long-term absences like that, but we are seeing an increase of teachers being stressed. And we are relating it to the aggressive behaviors in the classroom for sure. And we are trying to work and what can we do to mitigate that? Progressive discipline has been brought up. That has been a concern, and I think we need to work together on this.
Okay, that's all of my first-time speakers. I've got one person on the second-time speaker list, so we'll go to Trustee Lara.
So as the only person, I believe, sitting around the table who doesn't drive, I'm going to encourage, when you're thinking about dots and where you're assigning people, that giving them notice that if they do take public transit or if they are a biker or a walker, that they will be able to get to the place in a reasonable manner without out-of-pocket expenses. So I have some food for thought about when the changes were implemented about the stopping of sick leave rolling over. And my food for thought is, like, how many of the people are taking days off where they're sort of feeling kind of meh, and instead of showing up to things, they're like, I'm not feeling super great, I'm going to take the day off, versus when the days were rolling over, they would have just shown up. And how many people, when the days were showing up, were just showing up sick? And I sort of want to get a staff comment on if we have any sort of inkling on if either of those two things are true, and if so, in what numbers.
Through Madam Chair, it would be mere speculation in terms of either of those questions. So I think, we certainly would never encourage staff who are sick to come to work. We want staff who aren't well to take the time they need to get better. We also know that there are staff who might have under the old program, but who would still under the new program, even though they weren't well, drag themselves into work because that's the kind of committed staff they are. In terms of those who would have previously but aren't now, again, it would be mere speculation on my part.
So the sort of thing that I want to vocalize is that having a case of the sniffles will keep you at home if you have sick days that don't roll over, because you're not going to be able to utilize them at a later point. But a case of the sniffles won't keep you at home if you have something to lose over it. Does that make sense? And sort of the thing that I'm thinking about this, some of my colleagues have raised that there's demographical changes happening amongst our teachers, and that might come with a mentality shift about what the nature of work is. I'm wondering if staff have a comment on that.
So, Madam Chair, I'm not sure I caught quite the last part of Trustee Lyra's comments.
I've been chit-chatting with other members of the trustee board, and there have been thoughts raised that because we are hiring like a new demographic, a younger demographic who might have a different expectation on the nature of work, if that might be contributing to the higher rates of absenteeism, or whether or not that is the case. That was the question I had a comment on.
Through Madam Chair, that's an interesting observation, and certainly, can't respond to, I don't have the data with me, but certainly something that we can look at in terms of whether or not there's a difference around absenteeism based on particular age groups, and we do have that information available to us, so it's something that we could follow up on.
I'd be really curious to know. Thank you.
I feel compelled to just add one thought to that. We need to be really careful when we start to attribute patterns of attendance and work ethic to demographic groups, because there are a number of contributing factors. So drawing correlations from a demographic pattern can take us into a slippery slope, and not really sure it would tell us anything that would inform our change in practice.
Okay, thank you. That is all the speakers to this item, so thank you all for that discussion. It was great. I will get back to my agenda page and then know what's next. Okay, information items. Do we have a report from OPSPA tonight? Nope, nothing from OPSPA. Any new ministry initiatives? Nope. There is an OSTA update from the minutes, I guess, are there from the 25th of February. Is there anything in particular to pull out? No. Is there any new business? Trustee Lara.
A number of school boards have, such as I'm sure you all saw the CBC article talking about how Guelph is laying off 54 teachers. I'm wondering if our school board has put forward any sort of numbers on the number of proposed layoffs based on the program changes or cuts, or if we're willing to put that sort of statement forwards.
At this point, no, we don't have any numbers that are attributed to that. We're still working through our staffing process, and any surplus letters and anything of that nature are all compliant with our collective agreements. But at this point, we don't have a number to generate for that purpose.
All right, thank you.
Trustee Boothby.
Thank you. I didn't get my hand up quickly enough. Under the Oster report, there's a line in here, and it's page 35 under the financial update. And it says, further, there's increased demand in new construction area as well as transit for refugees. I'm wondering why that was specifically pulled out. I'm assuming that the refugees that are in our systems were compensated for the same way as any student.
Anybody have an answer to that? No. Perhaps we could communicate back to OSTA and ask that question.
So it's just saying that that's why there's more small vehicle usage? Like I'm curious why that's pulled out. It's almost as though we're offering a service that's outside of our regular student services.
Quickly, Madam Chair, when we talked about small vehicles, one of the challenges we've had when we get into some of the newer construction areas is you can't get a yellow bus down there. And so the compromise has been to provide smaller vehicles. With respect to the transit for refugees, it may not have been captured very well in the minutes. We have, OSTA has, in consultation with the school boards, we have from time to time made exceptions to our policy for those families that may have been uprooted partway through a school year, and we agreed that we would transport those children back to the school they were attending for a period of time to help with that transition. So similar to what we used to do sometimes for families that were in crisis and might have been in a shelter, we've been offering that support. It could have been handled better in the minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, Trustee Penny.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just noticed similarly in the Oster report that there was a review on a consultation on inclement weather, which looks like, and this has been raised by a number of our constituents, and I just wanted to confirm that in fact, a review was done, but it really consisted of more or less looking at the policies of other boards, other consortia around the province, and that seemed to be it, and no further consultation was required. So is it true that the weather's getting warmer, so this item is sort of off the books? Was that the conclusion?
Madam Chair, I think we had asked, we being, I guess, the school boards, had talked to OSTA about taking a look at what other practices were. They did some initial review to determine whether a wider consultation would be worth proceeding with. And I think we as the board of OSTA felt that when we looked at the variety of issues that would be involved, not just with transportation, but with school operation of schools themselves, I think it's fair to say that the 8 directors of OSTA didn't feel it was timely to proceed at this time.
Okay. I can't remember the last time we had Miss Kiriako in to visit with us, but I know we had talked about maybe having that happen a bit more often, and perhaps it would be time to start thinking about inviting her again. Trustee Lyra.
I just had a really quick question for CFO Carson. You said that new construction wasn't able to accommodate school buses. Is this just while it's under construction, or is it that they're just not building streets with turns the school buses can take?
No, Madam Chair, it's the first. When we will occasionally have families moving in before construction is complete on the street, we aren't able to get buses down there, or you might get stuck behind construction equipment. So in the past, we wouldn't go down those crescents at all, and we would require families to come out. Just because of the timing of construction in some of the neighborhoods, OSTA has moved to providing smaller vehicles to accommodate that.
Thank you.
Great. Seeing no other new business, we are adjourned.